So this lecture looks at sort of the basic foundation of Sparta as a city-state, sort of its cultural, political, economic, and legal systems, and particularly focusing on sort of some of the features that make it so unique. It's interesting because we tend to think Athens when we think about sort of ancient Greece, and in fact, Sparta was by and far the dominant city-state in terms of its military, but also there was just sort of this consensus that the Spartan government, a consensus amongst elites, that the Spartan government was sort of the sort of best form of government because it combined democratic, oligarchic, and monarchical features. At least that was according to Aristotle. So this is going to take us from the end of, or the beginning of the Archaic period to just before the series of wars with Persia. So early Sparta in the 6th century is a pretty typical Greek polis, and we sort of define the features of that in the other lecture. And so just this sort of self-governing city-state, it was a pretty active manufacturing center. It was particularly known for its ivory carvings, and you can see an example of that here. And it also did actually produce quite a bit of poetry and literature, given the time period compared to some other city-states. We do know there's evidence of trade, of minting coins, or at least someone owning coins, and economic exchange. But this all sort of shifts in the early 6th century, and I'll talk about why in a second. But what we see is that after the 6th century, this real decline in literacy, a decline in artistic production. They're not writing things down the way other city-states are as we move forward in time. And the chief guiding principle becomes sort of just the preservation of Spartan society, and that's where all their energies are directed. So this shift is prompted by some changes in the configuration of Sparta, geographically as well as politically. So here's a map that sort of zeroed in on the Peloponnesus, that sort of landmass that's just connected to the rest of the mainland by that little isthmus there. So Sparta is located in Laconia. And initially, its location is ideal for defense. It's sort of on high rocky ground. But over time, as the population begins to expand, what they discover is that it's not such an ideal site in terms of agricultural production. So they begin to look outward and think about expansion. They do attempt to fight a war with Argos in the north, and they are not successful. And so then they look southeast, and in particular towards the area called Messenia. This is like sort of flat, fertile plains right along the coast, and it's much more conducive to agricultural production. It is already populated, so when the people from the sort of the conglomeration of villages in Laconia look towards Messenia, it's going to come in the form of conquest. So they fight a series of wars against the people there. The first one around 690. This isn't terribly well documented. But we do know that that initial sort of foray gains them about about a third of the territory of Messenia, and then later on they continue that expansion northwards until they control all of that sort of area. So what this then produces is this really sort of unique tiered society. In a lot of instances, this type of conquest is going to result in eventual assimilation. We really don't see that here, at least not until the very, very, very end. So Spartan society then is comprised of these three different groups. So when I say Spartans, I don't just mean people who live in Sparta. I mean a specific group within that population, and they have to meet certain criteria, which I will walk through. So just the way that not everybody living in the United States is a United States citizen, not everyone living in Sparta is a Spartan citizen. So you have at the top this elite then. So they own all of the land. So as they conquer Messenia, they sort of carve up all that land amongst the families that are part of the conquest. And their primary occupation then becomes a full-time service to the state, specifically not just governing, but military training. And this is necessary because this population that they've conquered way outnumbers them, as many as maybe 10 to 1. And so in order to sort of maintain control of this population, they have to develop, at least their view is, they have to develop this army that is just without parallel. So you have Spartiates. So these are the Spartans. These are the people who are at the top of this hierarchy. Then you have this sort of middle group who they call the perioikoi, and that just sort of translates into those who live around us. They are self-governing. They do have to serve in the army, but they don't have a political voice. So they're not eligible to participate in Spartan government. Unlike the Spartans, however, who do not engage in any sort of manufacturing or trade or economic activity, the perioikoi, this is where trade and manufacture comes in, and also a lot of agricultural production. Why they occupy this middle status is not clear. They may have been sort of the first wave of conquered people. We just don't know because of the lack of sources. At the bottom, I think it's a group of individuals called helots, and that translates into sort of captured, so those who were conquered. And so these helots are sort of, sometimes are referred to as slaves, though they look a little different than slaves elsewhere in the ancient world. I think it's they're often compared to sort of a medieval serf. So they were conquered by the Spartans during that final push. Their lands were confiscated, and then they were put into a state of permanent dependence. So they are owned by the Spartans, but there's a prohibition against emancipation. They can't ever be freed. So they're almost more like state-owned and just divvied up among Spartan families. And unlike other places in the Greek world where slaves are bought and sold, that is not the case here. They cannot be bought or sold or exchanged. They live independently in their own households with their families, sometimes in sort of villages, sort of clusters of helot families, especially as you get further into the Messinian plains. And so in that respect, like, they do have this sort of different sort of status than what we would expect with typical Greek slavery. They do owe 50% of all the produce of the land that they work. So the land is owned by the Spartans. They work the land. 50% of that goes to the Spartans. That does mean, though, that they do keep some of what they produce on their own. And some helots actually do manage to amass a fair amount of wealth. That said, they can be killed without penalty. In some instances, as part of training for Spartan soldiers, they're sort of the prey in these sort of games of sort of hunting. They also are subject to sort of ritual humiliation, where they're sort of brought in and forced to get really drunk to show Spartan boys like what not to do. So they're certainly at the bottom of this system. And you can see this image here. This is a helot, so he is sort of bare-chested, and he's surrounded by these other Spartans. So the system then that they put into place is a really unique system, even in the Greek world. And so it's a combination of compulsory education focused at developing and just an unstoppable military, but also a unique political system. And so this falls under this term lycurgon, because it is ultimately attributed to sort of this distant figure in the Spartan past named Lycurgus. We don't know if there really was a person named Lycurgus. We do know that the Spartans like to claim that the system doesn't change over time, but scholars have been able to identify various moments when it does change. So it's kind of like they introduce a change, and then in order to validate it, they say, oh, well, this is what Lycurgus wanted. But in any case, it is a very unusual system. So you have the agoge. So this translates into kind of training or raising. And so this is compulsory education for all Spartans. So regardless of wealth, regardless of socioeconomic status, every Spartan boy and girl is subject to some training. This training is specifically the path that the boys take. So around 7, they live home. So Spartans have these landed estates outside of the city of Sparta. So the boys leave home and then they go to the city at the age of 7. They then sort of sleep with other boys from their same age group from that same region, and they begin sort of basic bonding activities, sort of dancing, engaging in athletic events. Every evening they take their evening meal together, they sleep in the same mess together, and they begin some really fun basic sort of reading and writing. So just acquiring really just a minimum amount of literacy, because their time is not going to be spent engaged in those types of educational pursuits. Once they reach 13, they really begin military training in earnest. And so using weapons, tactical exercises, drills, hunting. Also, they really subject them to a lot of sort of harsh conditions. So as they're training, like real violence is encouraged to make them tougher. If they fail in a task, they are punished pretty severely. They're also introduced to austerity. So cold baths, minimal food, very uncomfortable sort of bedding situation. And this is all sort of monitored by older members within the community to make sure that they are fulfilling these requirements, and also to identify individual boys who have particular promise. So the dominant dynamic here is competition, 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 and the goal is to achieve honor. So if things go well, they reach they reach 20, then they become a member of what's called the homoioi. And so this is a Greek word for sort of similars or equals. So the idea is that then once you successfully pass this training, all Spartan males become citizens. They all have equal standing, though that's not totally true, but they're all sort of equal standing, and then they get assigned to a mess. So this is a group of about 15 men total. This is who they will take their evening meal with for at least the next 10 years, but potentially, if they wanted to, for the rest of their life. They're expected to supply daily rations to sort of contribute to the evening meal, and then there's a small tax they contribute as well. But then this also is the moment when they acquire citizenship, and political participation is open to them. By the age of 60, if they make it that far, they're able to retire from the military, and they're no longer required to serve. So there are a number of sort of rites of passage that are associated with this education. Some of them intended to instill in these boys sort of an ability to endure difficult conditions, to make them stealthy. So for example, this is a sanctuary at Artemis Orthia, and there was a ritual where like they keep these boys on the brink of starvation, and then they encourage them to steal cheese from the sanctuary. But initially, it's not supposed to be easy, and they have the sort of the way to the sanctuary lined with elders who have whips, and so they try and flog the boys to see who can withstand sort of the most punishment. Whoever is able to steal the most cheese then is the winner. We do know from some ancient sources that sometimes the flogging is so intense that some of the boys actually die. So this is some serious sort of military training. Also, they are, when they reach 13, assigned a mentor. So this is someone who's 20. And the idea here is that the older male is supposed to sort of train the younger male, inspire them with Spartan virtues, teach them some of the social norms, The older male is referred to as the inspirer, and we do know that there is a sexual component to this relationship. Once the younger boy reaches a certain age, then they no longer are in this sort of relationship, so it's just intended to be for this particular phase of each of their lives. And then once the younger boy reaches 20, he gets his own sort of mentee, and then he becomes the mentor. So the ultimate goal of all of this is not loyalty to the self or loyalty even to one's family, but loyalty to the state. And we even see that in the way Spartan marriage works. So they're eligible to marry when they're 20. Marriages are typically arranged amongst families. Even though, and then so the wife typically lives in the family's estate in the countryside while the husband remains in Sparta. He's required to eat his daily meal with his mess, members of his mess. So it's hard for him to go back and forth and see his wife. Eventually, when he reaches a certain age, he sort of doesn't have to sleep with his mess. So once he's 30, he's free to go home and sleep at his wife's. The upshot is these two don't see each other very much. And so we do know that over the course of time, because of military losses and because of declining birth rates in Sparta, the number of Spartan equals takes a dramatic drop. So it starts out early on in the 5th century at around 8,000, but by the end of the Peloponnesian Wars, they're numbering in like the hundreds. One of the innovations they introduced to try and counter that is sort of open marriage. So a Spartan husband can choose someone to sleep with his wife with the hope that then she will get pregnant and produce a Spartan child. Also, brothers can sort of share wives as a way to kind of increase their birth rates. If you are not fortunate enough to pass your training, you are labeled an inferior. You lose citizenship. You lose all of the rights and privileges of a Spartan equal. And this would be considered sort of a real sort of detriment. So the other part of the system is the Spartan Constitution. And so you have this strange sort of configuration of different governing systems that are intended to sort of balance each other out. So just like everywhere in ancient Greece, as they move out of the Dark Ages, the responsibilities that used to sort of rest with the king are gradually sort of distributed over a larger number of individuals. Unlike a place like Athens that's going to dispense with monarchy altogether, Sparta does still retain the office of king. So there are two kings. This is sort of a hereditary position because they have to come from two families that they believe were descended from Heracles. And so there is this hereditary element, but then within that family, the kings are chosen for their sort of abilities. So you have the king who is very much sort of the head of state. He has a lot of religious duties. So the king is sort of believed to have a sort of a sacred dimension and a particular relationship to the gods. So he oversees a lot of public ceremonies and sacrifices. He also has some judicial duties. So like he's responsible for rulings related to adoption or like public roads. But that's sort of a minimal element. His primary responsibility is military leadership. So whenever a Spartan army takes the field, at least one king has to be leading it. Then you have this other group of individuals called ephors. So the ephorate is comprised of 5 individuals, and these are sort of overseers. So they each have a 1-year term. Any citizen is eligible to serve in this. You don't have to meet any sort of age requirement. They're chosen by the assembly, but you can only serve once in a lifetime. So there's meant to be a lot of turnover because this is potentially a really powerful sort of position. They sort of in part then are providing oversight, especially for the king. So whenever the king leads an army into the field, at least one of these will go with him just to make sure that any spoils of war are accounted for and distributed and brought back to the state. They're also responsible for sort of internal security within Sparta and sort of overseeing the finances, the collection of taxes. And they are, in part, they provide oversight for civil cases and engage in a lot of diplomacy. Then you also have this body of elders called the Gerousia. So it's 28 men over the age of 60. And again, they're sort of chosen by the assembly. And then the two kings are automatically part of this. And so the Gerousia really controls foreign affairs, so whether or not they're going to go to war, but also it's the Gerousia that drafts legislation. So any new laws that could potentially be introduced into Spartan practice have to be introduced by the Gerousia. And then what they do is they take those laws and they present it to the assembly. So the assembly is comprised of all Spartan equals, and then you have to be 20. You have to pass your training, and then they sort of affirm laws. So they can't originate laws, but they can approve the ones that are introduced by the Gerousia. And this is all acclamation, so it's just sort of yay or nay. They do, though, have some sort of element of approval over decisions. So do you want to go to war, yay or nay? And so this is sort of the democratic element of Spartan society. So this is why someone like Aristotle, who examined like 200 different constitutions across the Greek world, believed that the Spartan was the strongest because it has this distribution of powers and a balance between sort of this democratic and this oligarchical element that the Greeks believed was important to sort of check some of the negative elements that could stem from democracy alone. This is what's left of Sparta. So ancient Sparta, for the most part, has been abandoned. The settlement is kind of on the other side of those olive groves. And then you can see Mount Taygetus in the background. So as Sparta then becomes more and more dominant as a military power, it learns through trial and error that the best way to extend their influence is through voluntary alliances, not through military conquest. And so as Sparta becomes more and more powerful as a military force, Sparta basically has a tradition where if you go out into the field of battle, the only way you come home is on your shield because you've died. So it's sort of this all or nothing complete expectation of victory. And for the most part, Sparta is remarkably successful. They will not lose a battle on the Peloponnesus until the 4th century. So almost every Spartan army that goes into battle is in fact successful, or on a few occasions when they're not, they're pretty much annihilated. And we'll look at some of those when we talk about the Persian Wars. So they definitely achieve that goal of military supremacy across the Greek world. And so gradually more and more of these other city-states, especially sort of located close to Sparta, and so they're kind of under that reddish pink there. So these are states like Tegea, Corinth, and Megara. They enter into this agreement with Sparta. So the agreement is between the city-states and Sparta, not amongst each other. And that gives Sparta a lot of control. And then so these city-states will supply troops when Sparta needs them. So if Sparta is going to go into the field, it can call on its allies for reinforcements. And then in return, Sparta agrees to protect its allies as needed. So if they're threatened, Sparta will intervene on their behalf. This really is going to come into play after the Persian Wars when we look at the Peloponnesian Wars. Initially, this is just sort of a really loose arrangement, but over the course of time, it becomes more and more sort of hierarchical, with Sparta establishing more and more dominance. And even though every city-state gets a single vote, just because of the nature of the way it's structured and Spartan supremacy, as well as the just unrivaled power of the Spartan army, Sparta's pretty much able to dictate the foreign policy of its various members, as well as the foreign policy of the Peloponnesian League itself.